Many hold the view that pain and pleasure are morally symmetrical. What this means is that a given amount of pain and an equal amount of pleasure have the same moral weight. Lots of people, however, have rejected this view. So consider a case like this. Suppose you're given a choice. You can either prevent X amount of suffering from occurring in world A, or you can create X amount of happiness in world B. The question is, should we be morally indifferent between these? Well, if we believe that there is this moral symmetry, it seems we would have to think that there is just as strong a reason to create the happiness as there is to prevent the suffering. But certainly my own intuition is that one ought to prevent the suffering. That is, we ought to give greater weight to the prevention of suffering in this case. And I think it's possible to defend this intuition. Well, Karl Popper, as many of you may know, argued that there is a moral difference between suffering and happiness. And that difference is that, as Popper explains, and this is a quote from Popper, suffering makes a direct moral appeal for help, while there is no similar call to increase the happiness of one who is doing well anyway. In other words, there's a sense in which pain is a problem. It's something that needs to be taken care of. It's something that needs to be fixed, so to speak. It demands our attention. Whereas it seems to me the absence of happiness, or even the loss of happiness, is not really a problem in the same way. Now, accordingly, it seems not implausible to say that suffering should generally be given priority over happiness. Now, when we apply this priority view, if you like, to the question about whether or not to create new beings, we face a problem. Namely, are we justified in creating happiness, knowing that we will also thereby create suffering? Well, this view, if correct, suggests that we ought to give priority to the prevention of suffering, even when this would involve foregoing the opportunity to create happiness. And so you get an argument for antinatalism, for not creating life. But does this mean that pain should always be given priority over pleasure? So imagine a world that we know will contain a very large quantity of joy and happiness, but the downside is that it will also contain a pinprick, to use the classic example. And this single pinprick is the only negative value that this world will have. And so the question is, would we really think that the prevention of this pinprick, this pain, is a sufficiently strong reason not to create this world? Now, you might, of course, think it would be, and that we ought not to create this world. That's a possible position. Perhaps it's a defensible position. But others might think this is a rather counterintuitive result. But one possible response for those who do find this counterintuitive is, rather than completely reject the sort of view I described, one can try to accommodate cases like this by taking the view that suffering imposes constraints on the production of happiness, in the same way that, for example, safety imposes certain constraints on the architect. On this view, we needn't think that happiness has zero weight, but rather that the production of happiness must be kept within a certain acceptable range of suffering. So using the analogy of safety constraints, we would, most of us, agree that no amount of aesthetic value of a house, say, can excuse a failure to meet a minimum safety standard. That is, if you're thinking of building a house, there are certain degrees of structural unsoundness, such that no addition of aesthetic value will ever be able to justify the building of the house. Similarly, once you reach a certain level of suffering, you can't compensate this by introducing any amount of happiness. This sort of threshold view, according to which there are amounts of suffering or kinds of suffering that no amount of happiness or joy can offset, also seems to yield an antinatalist conclusion. And again, I think this is quite an intuitive view. For example, we can ask ourselves, is there any amount of happiness that would outweigh all the suffering caused by the slave trade? Well, it's difficult to think so. And I think it's on some basis like this that David Benatar says it's simply indecent to think about how much good would we need to justify or outweigh the badness of creating a being who may be raped, who may die of cancer, or suffer some comparable evil. Now, this kind of bad, which very often befalls beings who come into existence, certainly seems to exceed this threshold. And so, just as safety imposes certain constraints on the architect, suffering similarly imposes moral constraints on all of us. And it suggests that we ought not to create lives on the ground that they are likely to contain great suffering. But in any case, I think this is a possible basis, one possible basis for antinatalism, though it's by no means the only possible basis for the position.